Today we get to talk about Latin America and how imperialism comes into the Americas. So let's jump back a little bit here and look at how imperialism comes to be in the Latin American countries. Before we get into some of these big boy countries, we need to talk about how Latin America develops and how it gets to where it is. So the early Latin American nations largely are run by those that have power and have money. And so all this political aspiration and the drive for power doesn't interest a lot of Latin American countries because many of them are too poor to really worry about exchange and trade with other parts of the world. Many of them are still trying to sustain themselves and just get through another harvest season and to make money for their family, and that's about all they can afford to do. And there's a system in which the peasants are unable to get themselves out of debt. The landowners are growing extremely wealthy. They're starting to do some trade and exchange with other parts of the world. But those that are on the lower class really have very little involvement in that trade and that exchange and that growth of wealth that's starting to happen as a result of rapid industrialization. The situation is not helped by the way in which their political system is set up. There's a lot of corruption that goes on in Latin America, especially with some military dictators. They're known as caudillos. These caudillos are backed by the military, and they're often supported by the very wealthy because they know that if they do what's going to be in the best interest of the wealthy, then they're going to have the support militarily, and they're going to have the money to fund their military. And it's just a circular system that keeps this all in place. So these military dictators, they usually gain and they hold power for a very long time. And most countries in Latin America are controlled and run by these caudillos. Once in a while, you get somebody who has aspirations of trying to make life better for the common man and the common people. However, if they do get office, they're there for a short period of time before they're once again forced out by the caudillos, by the wealthy, or the military that are supporting somebody else rather than these reformers. So most of the time, caudillos are writing laws and are enforcing them in a way that is going to help out the wealthy and the upper class. And that means that the poor people have very few rights in Latin America for the most part, and they lack a voice in government. As the economy begins to grow worldwide, we see the effects of more international cooperation, and we start to see more exploration and industrialization that happens. There's going to be a desire for Europeans to come into Latin America for the resources that are there. And as that happens, these economies in Latin America often are relying upon one or maybe two major industries, and they're going to do those really well. A lot of times it's agricultural nature. So one of my favorites is the coffee bean. As some of these countries are really good at producing the coffee bean, they're going to produce a lot of it and use the funds that they get from selling that off to then buy all the other things that they need. It's a pretty good system when it works. As long as you've got a good coffee harvest and you've got a buyer, then you're going to be able to make a lot of money being able to do that. And so as these economies are dependent upon somebody buying their coffee beans or buying the bananas or avocados, whatever they happen to be growing, they are going to have new markets that they're going to be able to sell to with the transportation that now exists through refrigeration, through better shipping, through trains, and the international connections that are beginning to happen. And because of that, you're going to have more interest in those coffee beans going all over the world. Well, as that demand increases, Latin America is left with two options. They're left with the option of trying to build off of that and create their own industrialized economy, or continue to sell their coffee beans, make a lot of money, and then import other goods from these other nations, or trade those coffee beans for other goods. And these are two different economic approaches. They choose the latter, where they're going to sell their coffee beans for the highest price, and then they're going to choose to import other goods from nations like the United States or nations over in Europe. And because of that, they're really focused in on that one commodity. They're going to have to take out some loans, and they're infrastructure is not going to be set up for success as well as some other countries that have fully industrialized. And so because they don't have all of that infrastructure set in place, their schools are lagging behind, their roads, their hospitals, their basic infrastructure needs some assistance. And so they reach out to other countries for that help. And other countries are more than happy to come in and to do this work for them in exchange for something. And there's always a deal to be made here. So these governments then offer to help or to provide a loan, and Latin American countries jump on that and they take the loan. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not able to pay back that loan. And when they're not able to pay back that loan, here come those European countries saying, you didn't pay the loan, we want something in exchange for that. We want to try to recover some of our funds. So that could be taking land, or that could be taking control, that could be taking those commodities, those coffee beans, or whatever it is that they work out in that deal. And so we see more and more foreign control coming into Latin America. Well, the United States sees that some of this stuff is going on, and the United States becomes uncomfortable with it because the United States wants to keep Europe over in Europe, and they want to focus in on building themselves as a world power. And so we have the fifth president of the United States. His name was James Monroe. He had seen the United States go through multiple conflicts, and most recently the War of 1812. And as president, he decides, we've got to put a stop to this. So I'm going to issue a law or decree to all the European countries. And I'm going to say, hey, listen, we're going to stay out of all the European affairs, all your negotiations, your treaties, your wars, everything else. We're going to let you do what you want to do over there in Europe, and we're going to expect that you respect our part of the world and you stay out of the Americas. And we'll take care of them. We'll settle all those issues. We'll work out the treaties and negotiations here. But you stay on your half of the world. We'll stay on our half of the world. And everybody should be happy. So this is known as the Monroe Doctrine. And it becomes the United States foreign policy for 50 to 60 years. And many presidents are going to enforce this, some better than others, in which they are going to try to force Europe to stay out of Latin America. And it specifically focuses in on colonization and says Europeans cannot colonize in Latin America, and that'll help keep the United States free from entangling themselves with any of the European powers there. If we fast forward here to 1895, Cuba is going to want their independence from Spain. Now, Spain had gained enough influence and kind of wedged their way into Cuba and gained control there. And there's a writer by the name of Jose Marti that is a Cuban nationalist, and he wants to see Cuba get its independence from Spain. And so he writes some things that are trying to gain momentum toward fighting Spain for independence. Well, Cuba cannot get their independence for themselves. So the United States looks to intervene, and Cuba reaches out to the United States for some assistance here. And the United States doesn't want to violate its own Monroe Doctrine by jumping in and being the aggressor. And so they say, we're going to wait and see if Spain does anything, then we might consider backing this revolution. Well, in 1898, there is an explosion in the USS Maine. There is some questionable reporting and journalism that goes on here as far as how this explosion took place and who is the cause of the explosion. But it erupts into a war, and the United States goes to war against Spain, and this is the Spanish-American War. And the United States backs up the Cuban revolutionaries, and they're able to kick Spain out of Cuba and help Cuba get its independence. This is not the last time that the United States is going to intervene and get involved in another country and try to liberate them from an aggressor. It's going to happen many times over the course of history. As a result of the United States defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War, the United States also gets something in return. They're going to get territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And the United States will get those territories and still has a significant control over those territories even to today. After the war is over, the United States also begins to look at options for connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Because of the growing pressure of imperialism and because of the influence of many other European and now Asian countries that are becoming threats to the United States, as well as the open door policy that is happening over in China and Japan, The United States wants to have better access from coast to coast, especially if there were some sort of military attack on the West Coast. The United States would have to send our naval fleet all the way from Washington, Baltimore, New York, Carolinas, wherever it was harbored, all the way down through the tip of South America before it could get to help out anybody out there in California that was being attacked. So to cut through the middle of Central America made the most sense. And so Roosevelt went to the country of Colombia, offered him a really nice deal to be able to cut this canal through the country of Colombia. Now, Colombia wanted to play a little game with the United States and wanted to hold out for more money. Well, President Theodore Roosevelt was not the guy that you wanted to try to bluff, or you wanted to try to negotiate a deal or try to rip him off. So he decided that he wasn't going to negotiate. And Colombia said, no, we think you can afford to pay us a little bit more. Well, there was a section of Colombia that had wanted its independence. It's what is going to be the future part of Panama. And so they come to President Roosevelt and they say, hey, listen, you help us get our independence and we will give you the land you need for this canal. So that's exactly what happened. The United States backs a revolution in Colombia. The Panamanians get their independence from Colombia. Colombia is left with nothing. They lose everything. They lose their territory, they lose their deal with the United States, and they lose the canal. And so that's why the canal was built in Panama today, and the United States had a pretty positive relationship there for quite some time. Of course, that canal has now been turned back over into the control of Panama today. President Roosevelt also issued an addition to the Monroe Doctrine in his Roosevelt Corollary. So we said the Monroe Doctrine was President Monroe's address to the European countries saying stay out of Latin America and we'll stay out of Europe. Roosevelt decided to add to that, and so during his presidency in 1904, he issues the Roosevelt Corollary that says that the United States is going to be the police power over all these Latin American countries. We're going to be the big brother that is going to protect and watch over, and we're going to defend any of these countries if somebody else is going to jump in there. And this is met with mixed reaction by Latin American countries. There are many who look at the United States as their protector, their savior, who is going to keep the bullies of Europe out of Latin America. However, there's a growing number of Latin American countries that look at the United States as the bully themselves, almost like the big brother who wanted to take power and take control, and who said, yeah, you're too little, you can't handle the big world, we're going to protect you from all of that, you can't have any fun, you can't make any negotiations or deals, you can't go out and spend any money, you can't earn any money, life is going to be tough for you unless we give you permission to go out and enjoy life. That's the way a majority of Latin American countries view the Roosevelt Corollary, and so it's not very well received by that. The United States is going to use the Roosevelt Corollary to justify many of its military operations through this era of imperialism leading up to World War I. And by the time we get to World War I, Latin America has solidified itself enough to where the United States looks more toward Europe and Asia, toward where they're going to be involved a little bit more. This begins to be less consequential later on. However, for the time being and in this period of imperialism, the United States definitely grows its power and influence over the Americas.